Tonight is a special night because hopefully we're going to find out what makes us happy, who makes us happy, and if we aren't happy, what are the strategies we need to make us happy. And to help us out in our eternal quest for happiness is Paul Dolan, author of a new and best-selling book, Happiness by Design, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life, published by Penguin UK. Paul is an impressive individual, as evidenced by the sellout event here tonight in the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne. He holds a bachelor's, master's and doctorate degrees from Swansea University and from York University. He's a professor in the Department of Social Policy and Political Science at the London School of Economics. He's published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers on behavioural science and subjective well-being, which I take to mean happiness in an academic sense. He holds a number of advisory roles to various groups within the UK government. He's currently researching what he calls the happiness hit from the 2012 Olympic Games in London. Actually, I thought there was such a thing as the post-Olympics depression or deprivation-relevant syndrome. I might ask Paul about that a little later on. His last book, published in 2002, was in fact a collaboration on the economic and ethical issues associated with the distribution of healthcare, an academic book. So he's made that transition from academia into a more popular book. And from several of his online interviews, I also know that Paul has found his own brand of happiness through the sport of bodybuilding, so I might ask him about that as well. Please make welcome to Australia, to Melbourne and to the Wheeler Centre, Dr. Paul Dolan.
Thank you.
Firstly, Paul, welcome to Australia.
Thank you, Bernard.
My pleasure. And can you perhaps start by telling us what is happiness? Define it for us.
Wow, well, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm told that if I can hear myself in the mic, then you can hear me, so I'm assuming you can hear me at the back. Hello there. Well, that's the 2,500-year-old ethical question, so I'm not sure we're going to get the final answer tonight, but let me tell you about how happiness is measured and why I think there's problems with the way that we do that, and then say a bit how we should do it instead. When you hear stories about, does money make people happy, does being married, are the Aussies happier than the Brits, they're nearly always in response to questions, overall, how satisfied are you with your life these days? And people take less than 3 seconds to say 7, or some other number between 1 and 10. And I don't actually think that's happiness. Instead, rather than the stories that people tell about the things that they think should make them feel good, because that's basically what you do when you answer that question, I'd rather pay much more attention to how people feel moment to moment, day to day. So I'd like to ask you, how angry are you? How worried are you? How stressed are you? How much joy are you feeling? How much contentment? Pleasure, for sure, or pain. But additionally, I think it's important that we find out how much purpose or pointlessness people experience day to day. So how worthwhile is this conversation? How meaningful is it? How fulfilling is it? How worthless or pointless is it? And so I think happiness is located in people's experiences, day to day, moment to moment, in things that they find pleasurable and things that they find purposeful. That's what we should be measuring instead.
In your book, you actually have a chart, and I was drawn to the charts in the book, where you had on one axis pleasure and on another axis purpose. So you saw the two as being completely distinct, either pleasure or purpose. Is it not possible to have pleasure and purpose? Are workaholics not happy, and are hedonists unhappy? Yeah, Can you not have two in one?
So the first thing is to say that this is the first time there's been lots of discourse for 2,500 years actually about what purpose is, but it's nearly always in these big grand stories, the meaning of life, how much purpose do you think your life has? Whereas, once again, I'm much more interested in how people experience purpose day to day, moment to moment, looking after the kids, doing the garden, working. And in that sense, it is on the same footing as the experiences that we have that are fun. But I think it's a distinct category of experience. And of course, some things that people do, volunteering, for example. I was reading recently that 1 in 4 Aussies volunteer. That's something that people find both pleasurable and purposeful. Commuting is something that people find neither pleasurable nor purposeful. So there are things, of course, that can be both, and equally things that can be neither. But, typically, work is probably more purposeful than it is pleasurable. Watching television more pleasurable than it is purposeful.
In terms of purpose, I read about the volunteering aspect. So volunteering gives you purpose to life. But if you...
Purpose in your experience.
Purpose in your experience.
Yeah.
Is that... can that be viewed in any other way? What is it that you actually get out of volunteering that gives that purpose? Is it the feeling of validation? Do you feel love and affection? Do you feel valued? Is that what is behind purpose?
Well, you'd expect an academic at some point to say more research is needed, and more research is needed. Ideally, more research money as well. That would be quite helpful. But I think it's all of those things. But one of the great things about volunteering is that helping others is part of, obviously of that. And I think helping others is probably one of the most selfish things you can do.
Selfish
because
or selfless?
Selfish, because it makes you feel good. And we should be celebrating that a bit more. We should be encouraging helping others, not only because it helps other people, but also because you get a great deal of feedback that it makes you feel pleasure or purpose largely in your own experiences. And that's why helping others is a kind of win-win, because you feel good and you also get to help someone else as well.
If I interpret the thesis to the book correctly, happiness is that sweet spot between having a sufficient experience of pleasure and a sufficient experience of purpose. Is that more or less the argument that you put?
Yeah, so I mean, lots of academic research, well, some of us anyway, is informed by our own intuitions and experiences. Sometimes we're proved right, often we're proved wrong. And the pleasure purpose principle comes from two observations. One coming from a pretty bog standard working class background in the UK. I had family and friends that had lots of experiences of pleasure, but not a great deal of purpose in their life. And then you become an academic and work at institutions like Princeton and the LSE, and you find lots of people that have lots of purpose and don't have very much fun. And so I could take a little bit of each of those worlds and make the perfect happiness maximising agent. And that was part of it. And also, then secondly, thinking about whether to have children or not. And seeing myself as someone as a pretty good happiness maximiser, most of the data to that point suggested that I shouldn't bother. Because on balance, children are at best neutral in their effect on happiness.
In the moment or overall?
When people evaluate their lives, but also in the moment, if you just look at pleasure. Because as we all know that have children, if we're honest, reading the same story, listening to the same story again, teaching the times tables, tying the shoelaces, telling them to do things 50 times and being thankful when they do it on the 51st. There are things that you could be doing that would be more fun. But those activities do feel like they're worthwhile, and they do bring purpose, and that's also what made me think about the pleasure purpose principle.
This brings me another point in your book. There is another chart where you talk about happiness throughout the life cycle. So there are particular times in your life where you are happier than others.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so if we look at life satisfaction ratings, that question that I talked about earlier, overall, how satisfied are you with your life? It's unequivocally the case that there's a U-shape in age. That is, you start off happy, you end up miserable in the midlife, in your 40s, especially if you're a man, and then you start getting happier again from about 50 onwards, right through to the 70s till about the last 6 months of your life, which are not particularly nice. So all of the life evaluation well, I think the story of that is that when people are telling stories about their lives, they've got all the hopes and dreams of youth. They hardly achieve any of those things in midlife. And then they get over themselves by the time they get into their 50s. But when we look at experiences of mood and purpose, we get something quite different. And it's a bit messy, actually. Some feelings go up, some goes down. Aroused emotions tend to fall as we get older. Purpose is especially low in experiences in people that are young. It starts to increase again around the mid-20s. So we get something quite different when we look at people's experiences compared to the stories that they tell.
When do you move from peak happiness to this you? What is the cliff by which you fall off peak happiness and into that you? Is it 28, 29, 30?
Well, as I say, it's pretty messy in the experience data. You tend to have more emotions of calmness and contentment as you get older, and less of excitement and joy. But equally, you have less of the kind of stress and the angers and worries that you have when you're young. So things kind of tend to, I wouldn't say balance them out, but they kind of change in ways that mean in experiences of life, people are not that much differently happy across the ages.
If you look at the happiness of a community, say Melburnians, Victorians or Londoners, over generations, are you able to say that what makes us happy today is any different to what made us happy 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Are we slowly becoming less happy as a society, or is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I would expect to be able to give you a better answer based on the evidence than I can, because people haven't really looked too closely at that question. We've looked at changes in happiness over time. Australians have tended to get a little bit less happy for the last decade. In the UK, over the last 3 or 4 years, people have got happier, but we started measuring national happiness when we were about as miserable as you could get after the financial crash. So it's actually quite a good time to start measuring happiness, is when people are miserable. But the things associated with happiness, I think, if we talk about people's experiences, I think some of these things are universally shared. Everyone's different, of course, and the sort of detail of the experiences that we have will somewhat differ, but the basic insight that helping others makes you feel good is pretty universally shared. Find things that you can do to help other people, you're going to probably feel more purpose in your life. Spending time with family and friends, well, that's pretty universal. Listening to music that you like, that's pretty universal. Getting outdoors, having new experiences, these are all things that are pretty much universal, and I doubt they would have changed very much over time.
I suppose my contention is that in the 1950s, the 1960s, 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds that had fought in the Second World War, that had endured the deprivations of war, would have been, their bar to happiness, their threshold to happiness would be quite low. Peace, prosperity would have delivered happiness. Today in Australia, if you haven't got a plasma television, a mobile phone, holidays to Bali or wherever it is, then we feel dissatisfied. Is there a link between what we expect out of life and our contentment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge... I mean, most academic answers to the questions are a bit boring. It depends, context matters. It's about balance. They're all the answers I could give to pretty much any question that I get asked. But the expectations question is interesting. So you see, people would often think that the key to being happy is to have low expectations, because obviously if they're met, then you're happy. But that's actually not true, because optimists are generally happier than people who aren't optimistic, and optimists have quite high expectations. What an optimist is able to do is to interpret when their expectations are not met, that failure to meet their expectations, in ways that don't call into question their own sense of self. So if you go to a party and it was crap, that's because the host was rubbish, not because I made a bad choice to go to this awful party. And then you go to a new party again next time, optimistic that you're going to have a great time. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that, I think.
In the same vein, I read a UN report, the World Happiness Report, I think we've done a couple of years ago, and the people who were reportedly happiest on Earth were, in fact, the Danes, the Danish people. Australia came in at number 10. It only listed the top 85 countries or so, but they didn't have places like New Guinea, for example, a New Guinea tribe or an Amazon tribe that has very little connectivity to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Are they... How do you measure happiness in those tribal societies?
I think, to be clear again, there's not only a challenge with asking people how satisfied they are with their lives, because that's a very difficult question to construct an answer to, and so you're clearly not answering it if you answer it in less than 3 seconds. And secondly, the translation of the word happiness and life satisfaction is really problematic into different languages. When I gave a talk in Germany, someone told me that the Germans don't have a word for happiness, which is not that surprising. But the closest word, there is some Schadenfreude. They do have a word for that.
That's right.
The Germans do have a word for Schadenfreude. Yeah, but the closest word is luck, which is similar but different. And so I have problems with those international comparisons, and that's why I'm much more interested in how in much more routine measurement of how people feel day to day.
Take us through strategies to identify whether we are happy. Where do we sit on the spectrum between misery and happiness? Where are we at the moment? How do we self-evaluate? And then what are the strategies that you would identify to actually move us up on the happiness scale?
Yeah, so I mean, what I've done as an academic for 25 years now is think about policy answers to those questions. And in this book, I've tried to make it about agency, about what individuals can do for themselves in order to be happier. And so one of the things that I think we all need to do a little bit more of, but not too much, is to get a bit of feedback about how things are making us feel. Because, you're making about up to 10,000 decisions every day.
You want feedback from other people?
From other people, from
about
ourselves.
How you feel.
From ourselves, from other people. Other people can sometimes be quite a useful guide to us if we can trust them.
Am I happy? Paul,
yeah,
am I happy?
I mean, I think, and actually we know, is the answer yes? I think, obviously, you're talking to me. That's right. It's a bit of a stupid question. So, yeah, that's why I only ever get feedback that people are happy. Yeah, others can actually be quite a useful guide. In some evidence, even minimally trained observers are quite accurate at being able to report other people's happiness. But I think because we make 10,000 decisions every day, most of those are done by habit, by automaticity, by unconscious processes. And so there's a lot of things that you're just doing because you've kind of always done them, or because you've got into a rut doing them and you don't really think about doing them anymore. And so you need to, I think we all need to just to some degree step back and kind of think, are those things that we're doing, those habits, those automated loops, are they things that are actually making us feel good or not? Because they might not be. So a little bit of feedback to begin with then opens up we can talk some more about what we might do about that once we've done that.
So you would ask your friends and family whether they feel or they think or they observe that you're happy. That would be a start.
Yeah, but you should be asking yourself that question
first. Yeah.
Can I come back to? I want to just still kind of push this, how we're measuring happiness wrongly, because when people think about the things that they think make them happy, they're nearly always thinking about the things that they think should make them happy, and the things that they think should make them happy when they're thinking about how happy they'll make them. So not only is it a story, because it has a should statement in there, it's also based on a focusing effect that people like Kahneman talk about at some length in Thinking Fast and Slow, which is the idea that nothing is as important in life as you think it is whilst you're thinking about it. So, for example, when you think about a pay rise, will a pay rise make me happy? You're not answering that question, actually. You're asking the question, will a pay rise make me happy when I'm thinking about how happy a pay rise will make me? Well, yeah, of course a pay rise will make me happy, because when I'm thinking about the pay rise, it's making me happy. And you get the pay rise, and you stop paying attention to the pay rise, because it's not novel and new anymore, and the kids are screaming, the X Factor's on, you're stuck in a bus queue or traffic jam, all the things that draw attention to themselves in your day-to-day life that have nothing to do with whether you've earned a bit more money. So it, again, comes back to paying attention. That's absolutely critical. We are what we pay attention to the things that make us feel good and bad in the day-to-day of our lives, not in the stories.
So the first lesson is to be aware.
It's to be aware. It's to be aware,
to seek
I think,
feedback.
Yeah. Seek some feedback.
And if the awareness and feedback, your conclusion is, well, actually, I'm pretty miserable. I'm not happy.
Yeah.
I'm not engaged. What are the strategies?
Right, so that's when I have a line that I like in the book. There's lots of lines I like, but one is, lost happiness is lost forever. And if something is making you neither feel pleasure nor purpose, then you should probably stop doing it. You can't, it's not like money where you can transfer it around between different periods. Save more today to spend more tomorrow. Happiness, when you're miserable, you're miserable. You can't really get that back again by being happier later. So if something is making you feel neither pleasure nor purpose, probably stop it.
But there are some activities that you may not wish to do in the moment, but you can see a bigger picture purpose. So you don't want to commute, but equally I want to be able to provide for my family and lifestyle. That's right, and the welfare of other people clearly matters, and some of the long-term gains will sometimes matter. But I think you've got to be pretty convinced and pretty certain that you're going to get that payback. And I think once you have purpose as an experience, that kind of adds to paying attention to what you experience in the actual moment, I think. This idea of awareness, of being aware of your state of happiness or unhappiness, if you have happiness and you have misery at the end of a spectrum, is it fair to say that most people actually occupy some bland space in the middle? Is that pretty much what everyone would feel? We have a challenge. I mean,
one of the things that I think we can be confident from surveys is that people are pretty happy. But then most people that answer questions in surveys are probably a bit odd.
Right.
And they're probably a bit happier anyway. So it's quite interesting that we have observations on large-scale general population samples that I'm suspicious of being probably a little bit happier than the general population are at large. And then we have data from clinical populations that are a lot less happy than people are at large. So I don't know whether we really are capturing everybody to the extent that we ought to be.
There's one particular line in the book that I like, which measures occupational happiness. And this survey run, I think, in the UK. I'm not quite sure how representative or academically rigorous it is, but the conclusion was that the happiest occupations were florists, and the least happy were bankers. Does this because miserable people are drawn to banking and happy people are drawn to floristry?
Yeah, so one of the things when you write a trade book is you get licensed to write things that wouldn't get through peer-reviewed journals. And the correlation between occupation and happiness is problematic, to say anything causal, because you've touched on one problem, is that people might select into occupations based upon how happy they are to begin with. They have nothing then to do with the occupations that they're in. Insofar as there is anything causal in that, and I think there probably is a little bit, although the data, we haven't got randomised trials that show this, is if you think about hairdressing and floristry, they're right at the top of the list. They're occupations that involve social contact, generally with people that want to have social contact with you. You see the fruits of your labour relatively quickly, generally with people that like what you're doing to them. In contrast, banking, well, it's not to say that banking couldn't be designed in ways that make it more like floristry. Feedback, feedback of the fruits of labour. Feedback in work is absolutely critical, and I think this is where purpose comes in. I mean, some of you may have seen these experiments, but if you get people to do to build a Lego model, there is a point to this, by the way, and in two conditions. One is that that model is put into a box, and you build the next one, and you're paid to build each Lego model. People are kind of quite happy to carry on doing that for a while. In the alternative condition, that Lego model is broken down in front of your eyes as soon as you finish it, and the bricks are handed back to you to build the next one. People quickly get out of that experiment, even though they're being paid for it, and they mispredict how pointless that activity will feel in the experience. And I think this is why it's critical in work that we get feedback that what we're doing has a point. And a lot of people are in occupations where they don't really get that feedback. Floristry and hairdressing, you get that feedback pretty much instantly.
Is there a dividend to society of being able to shift the median happiness just a few percentage points towards complete happiness? What is the benefit to society if we're all just that little bit happier?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, from a welfare perspective, I'd be much more interested in improving the happiness of the least happy, first of all, right? So that we have a fairer distribution of happiness. But you don't actually, no one really needs to care about happiness as an objective or endpoint in itself. Of course, for me, it's the ultimate objective. But if you care about productivity, if you care about absenteeism, if you care about pro-social behaviours, all of these things are done more of by happier people. And even if you think, see, I first came to happiness data thinking, there's a point to anger and there's times when you don't want to be happy. But even if you think about protests, people out on the streets trying to get social change, they're angry people, but they have purpose. And they're also very, very optimistic that they can actually make a change by being out on the streets in the first place. So there's a purpose and a point to what would otherwise be seen as the pain. So in most of the data, most of the time, it's not true in every case, but we find happier people do all the things that we would want for society.
I'm not sure you're aware of this, that the Kingdom of Bhutan in 1972 initiated a measure called the gross happiness.
Gross national happiness.
Gross national happiness.
GNH.
So we have a gross domestic product, gross national product, which is a Western measure of success, economic success, whereas the Buddhist culture of Bhutan, the happiness index, or a measure of happiness. Is there something to that perhaps if we could adopt those principles, not necessarily Buddhist principles, but the philosophy behind it.
Well, it was interesting that even I think that statement starts recasting discussion, because actually what they didn't actually measure happiness at all for a very long time. It was based on objective indicators of culture and values and all these things. And then they thought, as we've been doing in the UK and other countries are now starting to do, actually, why don't we ask people directly how they feel? And I think for a long time we thought we couldn't do that. Maybe we couldn't trust people. But I think the data are now showing that you get, meaningful responses. It's associated with the things you might expect it to be associated with. If you go to your doctor and you've got a pain in your leg, one of the first things he or she will ask you is, how much does it hurt? And your medication will be based upon the pain you report. It seems to me to make much more sense to go directly to the thing of consequence, which is to ask people how they feel.
We've worked out that a lot of people are unaware, perhaps, of their state of happiness. We think that there is a dividend to be had by improving overall happiness. We need awareness. We need feedback. What are the strategies? We've decided we're less than happy. We want to be happier. Tell me what I need to do in order to achieve that.
Yeah, so the UK subtitle is the Australian subtitle, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life. The US subtitle is different because Americans don't get that. It's too vague. And just before it was about to go to print, we had to come up with a new subtitle. So it's change what you do, not how you think.
Right.
So you need to direct Americans to be told what to. So change what you do, not how you think. And that's central to the book's thesis. If you buy any self-help book from the self-help genre, of which there are a lot, it will say things like be positive. Yeah, no shit, I kind of worked that out. How do I actually do that? Change the way you think about things, change your perspective on life. Yeah, okay, how do I do that? And you can't, and you buy another self-help book. In fact, the single biggest factor predicting buying a self-help book is having bought a self-help book in the last 12 months. So they clearly don't work, because changing the way you think about things is really difficult. If you think about the last time any of you really changed your mind about anything significant or meaningful, it was a long time ago, because you believe something to be true, you seek out evidence that supports the belief, and you're right to believe what you did. When you find counterfactual evidence that doesn't support your belief, you're very good at telling a story about why that evidence doesn't apply to what you believe, and you carry on believing what you did in the first place, even more right than you were in the first place. So it's really hard to change minds. So given the fact that you're making 10,000 decisions every day, unconsciously, automatically, through habit, I argue that what you need to do is to design your environment, your day, your life in ways that make it easier for you to do the things that make you feel good without then having to think about it.
Is this the self-nudging principle?
Yeah.
The nudge principle?
Yeah. Someone, when nudge yourself or self-nudging, people have a kind of different interpretation of that. So I've tried to avoid nudging yourself happy, although, of course, that probably does help a little bit. But it's being aware of the fact, just like in policy making, we're aware of the very small things that we can do to have large effects on huge population behaviours. For example, in the UK, we've managed to get about £700 million in late taxes paid sooner in 3 years than was otherwise the case before, simply by tapping into the fact that we are social animals and we want to be like people like us. You tell late taxpayers that 94% of people pay their taxes on time, add a few other twists and tweaks that I can go into, but I won't now, and people pay their taxes. We want to be like people like us. So, if you want to change your behaviour, think about who in your reference group, in your peer group, in your norms, you can mimic, because you'll just start naturally taking on the actions of people like you. So there are lots of insights that you can use that draw on stuff that we've used in public policy making, just to make it easier. The really simple behavioural science insight, this is the really, really obvious thing to say, is that if you want to do something, make it easier.
Have you applied these principles to your own life? Right,
no, of course. I'm a happy guy.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, no, well, exactly. Yeah, no, I have in some of the things. I have with listening to music, having new experiences, which I was pretty good at anyway, I think. But it's in the small stuff. There's that saying, "Don't sweat the small stuff." It's actually the small stuff that we should pay attention to. Not the big grand stories, not the big plans about how we're going to have some fantastically different life if only something would change. It's actually day to day, moment to moment, designing in time, which is absolutely critical, finding the time to do the things that make you feel good.
You published the book in August of last year, so
Yeah.
8-9 months ago. What sort of feedback have you had from readers? Have you had anyone write to you saying, I have completely changed my life and I am happier? Have you had people say, I've completely changed my life and I'm miserable?
Yeah, I have. No, I've had. Yeah, that's not so much of that.
And they're blaming you.
It's been really interesting. The New Statesman quote, which which appears on the paperback, is "This is a book that will make you quit your job" or something, which is actually not a book about quitting your job at all. But what the book does do is that you again pay attention to the experiences that you're having and not the stories that you tell about the things that you think should make you happy. So lots of people will be in occupations that have status, maybe they earn lots of money. They think those jobs are making them happy because that's the story that they're told or they tell themselves, but actually day to day, they're not. And so a lot of the feedback has been from people who have, either quit their job, split up with their boyfriends or girlfriends, husbands or wives. Probably not the best advert, is it, this really? I'm not doing a good job for selling the book. Because their experiences are in contrast to the evaluations, to the stories that they're telling. It is worth saying, though, there have also been people that have stuck with things that society may be judging as being either a low-status job or not a particularly successful husband or wife or something, but they actually, in the experiences day-to-day, have a pretty good time. So it can work both ways. But that's what most of the feedback's been about.
This is a bestseller in the UK. Was it immediately a bestseller? And how has that impacted on your life? What does a bestseller mean in the UK?
Yeah, I don't know. It sounds good though, doesn't it?
It does.
I don't know how many copies it has to sell to be a bestseller. There was a lot of press around the hardback. I did lots of interviews for the national papers and radio stations and things, a bit of TV. But the paperback, Waterstones Bookshop, made it non-fiction paperback of the month in January, and that was basically when it sold. And there's a very good lesson in how most of what we do simply comes about, not thought about. There were many people that went into Waterstones Bookshop in January with no intention whatsoever of buying Happiness by Design. And there was my ugly mug in the window. There it was on sale at the till, and they pretty much couldn't help but buy it because their environment was driving them to behave in a particular way. Their intentions were something different, and that's a really basic lesson from science, is that our intentions are not particularly good guides to our actions. Environments and situations are. So it's understanding the impact of those kinds of effects that really matter. How has it changed my life? It's given me lots more opportunities to do things that I might not otherwise have got if people have kind of noticed me a bit more.
Like come to Australia. You have been out here before, haven't you?
I have, yeah, a long time ago. But right. Yeah, to come here, to go to Sydney Writers Festival tomorrow. Obviously, Melbourne's nicer.
Of course.
There's a real. I've noticed when I was here last time. There's this real tribal, sort of tribal rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney. It's like we're better. No, we're better. So that and lots of media opportunities as well now. It's good.
I'm fascinated looking at your CV. You're a professor at the London School of Economics, 3 degrees, a doctorate and so forth. How does a working class kid, a self-described working class kid from London, I don't know if it was the East End.
East End, yeah.
How do you go from
Not
the
Australian,
East End?
By the way. When I was in the States, everyone thought I was an Aussie.
Oh,
at least by a ratio of 2 to 1. Yeah. You'll take that as a compliment. I took it as an insult.
When I'm in America, they say you're from London, England, because the only other people that speak English that are not American are from the UK.
Right.
So how do you go from London's East End to a professorial position at London School of Economics? Yeah. How does that happen?
Well, by being smart, that helps, but also lucky. Luck. I want to pay attention to luck actually, because so one of the things that the human condition likes to do, the brain wants to tell stories. It likes narratives. So it's why we like films. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there's agency, there's actors. And luck is inexplicable in agency. there's no story to luck. It's random. It's horrible. We don't like luck as an explanation.
So what was the luck?
Oh, just by being lucky. Just by being lucky with either being smart, either by having opportunities to meet people in the right place at the right time. Kahneman had just won the Nobel Prize when I met him in Milan. We sat next to one another on a bus for 10 minutes. The next minute I'm going to Princeton to work with him. That's not by design. That's not by planning. That's not by organisation. That's by randomness. And I think that we don't like luck as an explanation. We want talent and effort to explain things because it just doesn't have the same narrative to it. But I think randomness is hugely important.
The other observation I make is that professorial position at London School of Economics, your last published book was an academic book, 100 peer-reviewed papers. How does it go down amongst academia, all of this popular success? Is there a tension between popular success and academic worthiness, if you like?
Yeah, I think academics would probably think that, the unpopular ones, I suppose.
They all
would
want
think
it.
there's a tension. Yeah,
they
of
all want
course,
it. They don't want to
they
admit
do.
to it.
Of course they do. Of course they do. Some of them have been notoriously bad at handling it. But I think there is certainly a perceived tension, and of course you can't do everything all of the time. It feels like the right way round to kind of have an established academic career, and then start doing things that are more popular, if you like. After having got the ground in place.
Was there something that changed your mind? When did you stop thinking, I'll do another academic book or write another academic paper and I'm going to do something that is completely popular? What was the turning point?
Yeah, I don't think there's a narrative that fits that very well. I gave an inaugural lecture at LSE when I joined, as people have to do at these institutions, and about a year or so after I joined, and talked about attention and some of the things we've talked about today. And someone came to me afterwards and said, you should write a book about that. And I thought, actually, yeah, that's actually probably the first time that I felt I had something to write in a way that would be accessible for a popular audience or of interest to a popular audience. So I think that was the start of it.
I must say that the text, the narrative, is very, very accessible. It doesn't reek of academia. It's very popular. It's very easy to read, and very engaging. And you can see why it's been such a popular success.
Thank you.
Have you been surprised by the interest in what makes us happy? Does this mean that we're not happy? We are fundamentally unsure of ourselves. We're unhappy. Along comes a best-selling author from the UK with The Secret to Happiness. Is that why this is a sellout tonight?
Yeah, I don't know. That's for other people to judge why they're here. But I do think, we could all do with being a little bit happier. And I'd like to make being happier easier. There's a lot of people think it has to be effortful and hard work. I've got to go on an 8-week mindfulness training program and then a retreat for 3 days where I can't speak or be spoken to. That sounds like my idea of hell. Of course, it works for some people, works for those that do it and stick at it, but I'd like to make it a bit easier to be happier.
If there was one thing that you would offer people here tonight, what is the one thing, now, other than seeking feedback or being aware, what is the one practical thing that we can all go home tonight and put into place to nudge us towards happiness?
Well, I don't know if this is the good answer, but Kahneman in his foreword says it's about giving people a framework, and the rest is up to the reader. I think the thing that people just really need to do is to get over themselves and really appreciate that most of what they do is unconscious, habitual, and automatic. And then be able to, everything else follows from that, I think, Bernard. You're able to then to step back from your life, from your day, and just think about using some of the techniques in the book about how you can make doing things that make you feel good easier. And I think it's that kind of humility about the fact that actually you don't think about most of what you do.
You've had tremendous success with Happiness by Design. Is the publisher pushing you to produce another book?
Yeah, well, I'll let you say the line that you said to me earlier because it's a very good line, but yes, they are.
My experience with publishing is that publishers will continue to demand more books from authors until the author actually becomes unpopular or drops dead. So they will want more books from you. Have they commissioned another book from you?
They do. And they keep saying, you've got to strike now while you're popular and whatever. I'm like, well, give me a minute. I've got to think about what I'm going to say first. Yeah. But there'll be a second one, but it's not coming any time in the next year or two.
There's one point in your CV, I'm not sure whether you penned this or whether it was written about you, that you're currently researching the happiness hit from the 2012 London Olympics. Can you tell us about that? I actually thought that there was a post-Olympics depression. I thought that was very clear in Atlanta. And I think Sydney, for example, went into a torpor after the 2004 Olympics. So is there a happiness hit that still reverberates through London? Yeah,
we don't really measure these things in longitudinal data, same people over time. And that's what we've tried to do in this panel of Londoners, Parisianers and Berliners. Because Paris was the counter, Paris would otherwise have won the games had 3 IOC members voted differently. And Berlin didn't bid at all. So we've monitored and followed people in London, Paris and Berlin. And as you'd expect, we're still looking...
Through the London School of Economics or through one of the government advisors?
No, through the LSE. We got a research grant from a big research council to do that, from the German funders, the French funders and the UK funders, to look at this in large samples. And we're still looking at the data to see what these effects are, because they're quite nuanced. But as you'd expect, London has a big hit in happiness in 2012. Unfortunately, Paris doesn't take a very big dip in happiness, which I was hoping for. But that's one thing that makes Brits happy, as you know, is miserable French. But that wasn't the case. But there does seem to be some sort of lasting legacy a little bit into 2013. One really interesting question, I'll come to this point about we know what we know to be true and then we search evidence to support it. I'm working on this with an economist colleague at LSE who is miserable, basically, and thinks that things like the games are a complete waste of public money that should be better spent on hospitals and schools and stuff. In contrast, I'm someone who likes to spend money on a party once in a while, and 1948 was the last time London hosted the games. 2012 was a pretty nice 2 weeks. It feels like it was worth it. And we each come at the data with our predisposition to find the answer that we know to be true. And that's, that's just a nice story about how we often don't change our minds about things.
In your in the bio, you talk about, or in I think it's previous interviews, you've talked about that bodybuilding makes you happy. Has that been part of your life for 25 years, or something you've discovered later? Or is it something that you have been aware of and you needed something to make you happier? Well,
it hasn't been my life for a long time, only for quite a while now, about the last 15 years, but I was a very, very skinny kid and adult until I started weight training. I think what I've learned is that it's a nice combination of pleasure and purpose. But most importantly, it's essentially mindfulness, actually, for me. Quite aside from the gains that come in body shape or anything else, but it's actually the only time, really, that I'm paying attention to what I'm doing fully, the next set of weights, the next reps, and nothing else is on my mind. And I think that's what's so
is it the
happiness
actual
making.
Bodybuilding process, or is it the structure in your week, in your day,
That's a good question. I mean, I think most people, if you do something for long enough, if you stick at it, it becomes quite purposeful. As you understand things better, music or whatever, art, you start enjoying it in a different way. You still get the pleasure, but there's a considerable dose of purpose to it. So I think that's why I stick at it. But it comes to this point actually before we talked about finding the time. I always find the time to train 4 times a week, wherever I am, however that, and even here. And it's about making time, because it really matters to me. And I'm really busy and I've got all these other things going on, but it's something that I just always find time to do. And I think a lot of people, when they use the excuse, I don't have time, it's because it doesn't actually matter enough to them to find the time, whether that be bodybuilding or anything else that they might be doing,
You arrived in Australia just a few days ago, is that
Yesterday.
Right? Yesterday, down to Melbourne today, up to the Sydney Writers' Festival.
Correct.
And then out on
Sunday. On Sunday, yeah.
Very good. So flying visit.
Yeah, you never want to stay long enough that you bore people out or tire them out or bore them.
Are you always evaluating personalities or nationalities with regard to the happiness? These are happy people, these are unhappy people. Have you formed a view tonight as to...
Well, I can't see anyone. I've got bright lights in my eyes. I'm actually hoping that there are people out there. I mean, maybe we can find out with some questions.
Exactly, that's right. We might now throw to the floor and ask some questions.
Yes, hi. My name's Jerry. I read in the New York Times that happiness is 50% biological. Have you done any research to back that up?
Yeah, so there is a huge genetic component to lots of things, right? Predispositions for a whole range of conditions, and you'd expect that to be true of happiness too. It's difficult to establish entirely genetic attributes because, as most things are gene-environment combinations, the epigenetics, it's really hard to attribute the main effect when you've got an interaction effect, basically. But of course, there's a huge component of genes, but we've all got a little bit of wriggle room within that by, you know, spending time with people we like, listening to music, going outdoors, having new experiences, all of which, whatever your predisposition is, would make you feel a little bit happier.
Hi. In your book, you seem to sort of suggest that it's better to act on your experiencing self than on your sort of evaluative or reflective self, and to sort of trust the experience rather than how you evaluate your life. But are there circumstances where maybe it's wiser to do the opposite? So, for example, when you choose on what sort of holiday to go on, you might sort of not think, well, if I go on an island, you know, sort of a nice sort of experience which I would enjoy in the moment. But then you could also choose something that's sort of a cultural, exploratory holiday that might involve some drama, you know, some difficult situations. But then when you come home, and over the years, at least in my own life, I've sort of experienced that I can laugh about those sort of challenging, that was challenging in the moment. I can laugh about them, that they're sort of a much richer experience, even though at the time I mightn't have enjoyed it as much. So are there times when maybe it's better to trust and to act upon what your reflective self might want, rather than the experiencing self?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. But let me be clear about what the experiencing self is. The experiencing self is all of your experiences from the moment you're born until you die, which include memories, they include anticipations, but particularly in your examples, include the memories of experiences that you've had, because they are experiences in the moment. When you're thinking about something that happened in the past, you are experiencing pleasure or pain or purpose or pointlessness in that moment. And so the experiencing self, your experiencing self, you said yourself, a richer experience. So actually, your experiencing self is maximized over the richness of your life, over the fullness of your life, by having a holiday that, if you just looked at the holiday itself, might not be the one that you think you should choose. So it's still located in experience, but just a richer conception and a longer time frame. And I think that's one of the reasons why peak end effects that some of you would have heard of matter so much. If you go on holiday, the two things that you remember are the journey home, when you're asked about it when you get back, but most significantly is the peak moment of pleasure or pain whilst you're away. Duration is completely neglected. How long you were on holiday for isn't encoded in memory. So basically what you should all do is have short, sharp shocks. Everyone should go away for weekends and not weeks, or weeks and not months, and have a really great time. Just one moment of great time where all the family coalesce and all come together. And that will then be encoded in your memory as having been a fantastic experience that you can then talk about for years to come.
But it may not give you the rest and recuperation effect.
No, if you want a holiday for rest, then you should go and do that. But you don't need very long. Most things in life don't have to take very long.
Won't go into that. Was there another question at the back?
Have you found a link between
Sorry, where are you? So hello.
Right. Have you found a link between a cheery disposition and personality to the level and amount of happiness?
An amount with personality?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have, unfortunately, in a lot of the large data sets, we don't have enough measures of personality and temperament of the sorts of things that we would like to know more about. What we do know is that extroverts report being happier. It's kind of what you might expect. Introverts, by the way, also like being around other people. They just like choosing who those other people are. Conscientiousness is associated with being happier, and unsurprisingly, neuroticism associated with being miserable. It reminds me of one of the first challenges we were given when we were in number 10 was a policy challenge from the Prime Minister's advisor at that time, who wanted us to look at marriage and relationships to see if we could make We could nudge people to make better choices. Because the social costs of marital breakdown for children and stuff are quite large. So it's it is a serious policy challenge. So I spoke to personality researchers and other people. Is there anything that you could do to predict the likelihood of finding someone that you were going to stay with? And the only conclusion is, don't go with someone neurotic, which is not particularly helpful if you're neurotic, and the rest of it is pretty random.
Should you, if you want to be happy, is one strategy to hang around happy people? I mean,
Yes.
Can unhappy people transfer by osmosis their misery?
Yes, misery loves company. It's really interesting, you see.
So dump your miserable friends.
Well, dump your miserable friends. That's actually a very effective thing you can do. But it's really interesting because when people talk about Facebook, they nearly always talk about Facebook as making them miserable because of all the happy posts that everyone's putting on there, the great lives that they're having that you're not. But actually, there is also a contagion effect of their happiness. Facebook did a study where they manipulated people's the mood on their posts. They got into a lot of trouble for doing that without telling people. But the positive effects actually made people feel quite good. So there's a negative contrast effect that you get from seeing everyone else having a great time, but there's also a positive contagion effect that you get from seeing everyone having a great time.
Right. Dump your friends that are miserable. That's the conclusion.
Well, I'll try and make them happier.
Make them happier.
Yeah.
Was there another question at the back? Yes, this one.
Yeah. Hi, my name's
Hi.
Naomi. I had a question. I'm interested as to why you chose the word happiness as your definition, because in the field of positive psychology, as you know, there's been a general steering away from that term due to it being socially loaded and actually linked etymologically to luck and chance. Why have you chosen to stick with happiness instead of well-being or a different well-being construct?
Yeah, it was interesting that the introduction, Bernard said subjective well-being as the academic term for it, makes it sound more scientific. And I think because happiness often in lay language is kind of it's really interesting actually around policymakers that happiness is often used as almost like a trivial pursuit. Which is why for policy discussions it's actually really quite significant, I think, that we use the term misery and suffering and we use a negative language, because no policymaker is interested in increasing suffering. At least they won't say they are. I mean, of course, they act in ways that suggest that that's not true. But they don't say that they will. So I think for policy discussions, it all depends on the audience. For policy discussions, misery and suffering and pain are the adjectives and words that we should be using. For a lay audience, if I had a book that was called Misery, Pain and Suffering, probably wouldn't sell as many copies. And so colloquially, in everyday language, happiness is a pretty useful word.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
I'm Leo.
Hi, hello.
Hello. I'd like to have a comment on consumerism and reward mechanisms and happiness. There's a book called The Chimp Paradox, which talks about the link between...
Now, that is a best-selling book.
What is the book again?
The Chimp Paradox.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was interested in your view on how we perceive consuming things to make us happy, whether this is in fact true, and to link that back to the comment made about economic benefit of increasing happiness through productivity.
Yeah.
When I suspect that if everyone were much happier, we'd actually buy a lot less shit, and wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, okay, so, so whether something is true or not, that's a really significant and substantive philosophical question. Things that are subjectively felt are true. I mean, happiness, subjective well-being is in the language, is a subjectively felt experience. And so if you feel it and it's true. That's it. And I want to be embracing this subjectivity because often it's used in a pejorative way. Oh, it's all subjective. Well, yeah, that's the whole point. The pain that you feel when I kick you in the leg is subjective. There's an objective measure of the speed at which my foot hits your shin, but that's not relevant to your experience of being kicked. And why should you use being kicked in the leg? Anyway, so subjectivity, I think we need to embrace that, and that is ultimately the essence of life. With the buying less shit comment, it's interesting. There are data, if you're materialistic and particularly driven by making money when you graduate from university, you are a lot happier if you get very rich, but you've just got to make sure you get rich. If you don't, then you're not very happy. whereas there's a much flatter relationship with other concerns in life, like social interest and things. So, and also, interestingly, with the consumption, there are some data, as I'm sure you'll know, that shows that spending money on experiences makes people happier than spending money on stuff. The studies are not particularly well conducted because they don't follow people long enough to know whether that lasts. And also some of that distinction between a material purchase and an experiential one is quite blurred. But that notwithstanding, yeah, we probably would be a little bit happier if we didn't constantly feel the need to consume more material consumption, I guess. But not to the extent that people have argued, I think.
Next question. Any other questions? Put your hand up. There's one just here on the left.
Hi, my name's Judy.
Hi.
Just back to that idea of not being with negative people or unhappy people. You know, when you think about the idea of volunteerism and assisting people, maybe that's a bit of a contrast that if you can, you know, be with these people and make them happier, where's the line?
Yeah, I wasn't seriously suggesting that we dump all our miserable friends.
Well, lots of
but
people
I do think,
suggest that.
as a point about making the miserable ones happier, that's actually a very interesting benefit of the volunteering issue. And actually just talking to people. There was a study in the US where people were randomised. They were paid to either talk to strangers or just keep the money. And importantly, people, not just when they spoke to strangers, felt happier, but significantly, they didn't predict that that was going to be the case. Actually, they didn't monitor the happiness of the people being spoken to, which would have been interesting to see whether they were actually happier from some random person talking to them on a train. But by and large, we do make ourselves and other people happier when we interact. So I think that's a nice example of kind of volunteering in a very loose way that wouldn't be called structured and organised volunteering.
Do you think some people simply refuse to be happy? They're actually seen to be happier when they're miserable and talking about their misery and their pain?
There's I don't know, do you get only fools and horses? Does that come across? Is that translated across the pond? Yeah? People have heard of that. So when Grandad dies in the series, an uncle comes in and he's talking to Rodney, and he asks Rodney how he feels, and he says, "I'm miserable today. I'll be miserable tomorrow. I'm going to be miserable for the rest of my life." And Uncle pats him on the leg and says, "So long as you're happy, son." And I sense that there are some people that actually do take some pleasure in their curmudgeonliness. But that's notwithstanding the fact, of course, that there are people who are miserable, and you know, public policy and hopefully reading a bit of Happiness by Design can help those people, because they're the people that matter most.
Hi, my name's Janet. I want to know about the relationship between poverty and happiness or unhappiness.
Can I just say, I love Aussies because they get to the point. If this was a British audience, that first question would still be going on. Someone would have given me another lecture. It's interesting. See, poverty makes people miserable. And so when people talk about money doesn't make you happy, it's true. In the experience data in the US, once you get beyond about $75,000, there are no returns at all to experiences of happiness. None at all. But there are every point up to $75,000. And so poverty makes people miserable. So we shouldn't assume that income doesn't affect happiness. But what happens is, money, like everything else, is a bit like heroin or anything else. The first hit feels really good. And then you just need more and more of it, chasing the hit that you had previously. And we forget, with a lot of things, that those effects wear off, but we're still chasing the first time. And we're still remembering the first time, and we still think it's going to feel like the first time. So, yeah, the short answer, poverty makes people miserable.
Thanks very much for that. I think we'll draw it to a close there. I'd like to thank Paul Dolan for his time tonight. I think we've all got a greater insight into what makes us happy and some strategies, perhaps, in order to improve our net position with regard to happiness. Paul's best-selling book, Happiness by Design, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life, by Penguin, $22.95 at all good bookstores. Make sure you pay full retail. So thanks very much, and thank you again to Paul Dolan.
Thank you all for coming.